problem with governments right now is that it's very difficult to understand what their rationale is for a lot of the policies and programs that they put in place. So the work they do, I think, is really important. The service that we deliver, education, healthcare, environmental things, this is really important stuff. The problem is it's so badly managed. And there's many examples I could give, but I wanted to give one example here and just talk about debt. In New Brunswick right now, we have $10 billion of debt. Canada has $1.2 trillion of debt. And the US, which is about 10 times our size, has about 13 times our debt at $16 trillion. Now, this is money that government in Canada, public institutions, have borrowed to deliver services that have been in the past. To put this in context, what I'd like to do is ask you to indulge me and engage in a little thought experiment. So I don't think the human mind can really comprehend the concept of 1.2 trillion. So I want to put it in context. If we had a repayment schedule of $1 per second, how long would it take us to pay back $1.2 trillion? And the answer is 38,000 years. It's an astronomical figure. So $1 a second for 38,000 years would be $1.2 trillion. This is the equivalent of 447 lifetimes. So I'm not talking about generations. What I mean is that the average life expectancy of a woman in Canada right now is 84 years. 447 of those is what it would take at $1 per second to pay back our national debt right now. That's based on a couple of assumptions that I want to go through. So one assumption is that governments will have a balanced budget. Another assumption is that the debt we have has no interest. And another assumption is that we don't borrow anything else. All of these are false. Every province in the country, save Saskatchewan, had a deficit last year. Every loan governments have has interest that accompanies it, and they're constantly borrowing. So this is where I think we're in trouble. And the question I want to ask is, how did things get so bad? And what I want you to do is kind of give a challenge to the audience and say, what would it look like if the government made decisions according to clear and transparent values that maybe we don't agree on, but at least we understand? And right now, I think a lot of the values that go into decision making might not be clear, might not be transparent, and in fact, they're often ambiguous and frequently contradictory. And if you look at it, in the public sector, we don't know what that raison d'etre is. And to explain this, let me contrast with the private sector. In the private sector, what is the motto? Profit or perish, right? If I want to open a business, the bottom line is going to be important. If I want to expand to another location, I'm going to have to say, what is the impact of that expansion on my bottom line? If I want to hire more employees or improve the training of my employees or improve the service I offer to people, it's going to be because at some point, the idea of profit is going to be underlying my motivation. So it's not that profit's the only motivation. Private sector does lots of good stuff, but they have to make a profit as well. Otherwise, the viability of your business would be seriously jeopardized. In the public sector, we don't have anything that clear. We don't have a real clear raison d'etre that says, here is exactly why we exist. So what is it that can happen in the public sector? Well, there is no one thing that can happen that would cause us not to exist anymore. So in the private sector, what could cause us not to exist? Well, you don't make enough profit and you have to go out of business. In the public sector, what is it? And believe it or not, the only thing is bad credit. If you look at some countries around the world, what happened? They lost the ability to borrow, and as a result, their public sector dissolved. What do public sector do in Canada? Well, they basically have the ability to tax people and to spend money. And how do we determine what our taxation level is going to be? Well, it's really the whims of people running for political office, right? So I say, I want to campaign on something. Here's my campaign promise. Tax will increase, not increase, decrease, maintain, stay the same, something like that. Then they have a separate conversation about spending and say, here's what we're going to spend on. We're going to open a new hospital in your community, or we're going to maintain one in your community, or we're going to open a school, we'll fix your road, any of these things. Those two conversations are not really connected in the public discourse, but they're intimately connected in fiscal responsibility. So what happens when the tax revenue we have doesn't meet what we spend? Of course, governments borrow. And this is where we have a $1.2 trillion deficit right now that is going to be passed on to future generations because that money is already bought and spent. This is where I want to talk about values-based decision making. And I'm a professional philosopher, so we're going to do a little bit of philosophy right now and talk about some basic concepts in ethics that I think can help lend value to a discussion about what values-based decision making would be in the public sector. So I'm going to present my model to you, but what I would ask is for you to think about what do you think it would look like if we had clear and transparent, justifiable values in the public sector. So the first thing we got to talk about is the difference between facts, values, and beliefs. And to do this, I have this picture everyone's familiar with of a glass of water. And some people will say the glass is half empty. Other people will say the glass is half full. Right? The facts are the same. One glass with an amount of liquid in it. But people's belief about that glass, the interpretation I give to it, my personality behind it, lends credence to a belief. So some people will believe it's half empty, some will believe it's half full, and then we label that as a pessimist or an optimist or that type of thing. Of course, the scientist would say the glass is completely full of air and water, and a philosopher would say the cup is twice as big as it needs to be. But you can see people can look at the same fact situation and have a fundamentally different perspective on it. And this gives the next concept I want to talk about is values. What are values? So to understand what values are, I want to give a thought experiment. I think all of us could agree that $10 is worth more than a quarter, right? $10 is worth exactly 40 quarters. However, I might be willing to give you $10 for a quarter if I have to make a really important phone call, because I value the outcome of that phone call more than I value the $10. So at a purely factual level, or at a level of belief, someone will look and say, you know what, Tim? You're crazy. Why are you giving that dude $10 for a quarter when you can get 40 quarters for that $10? Or even try to get 41 if you're running a game. And I would say, you know what? The phone call I have to make with that quarter is so important, I don't really care about the $10. And then the person will say, oh, now that I understand your values, your motivation, I get the point. I understand that it looks like an unfair deal on the surface, but it makes sense. So that's facts, values, and beliefs. This is going to be relevant to our discussion about values-based decision-making in the public sector. The next one is building on this, and it's the different types of disagreements we can have. We can have fundamental disagreements and non-fundamental disagreements. A fundamental disagreement happens when we agree on the facts, but we disagree about what to do. And if we can agree on the facts and disagree about what to do, then we clearly have a values conflict. So we might agree that this couple is gay, but we might disagree about whether they should be able to get married or not, because we value something differently. We might agree that this person's an injection drug user, but we might disagree whether he or she should have access to a supervised injection site where they can inject illegally obtained drugs under medical supervision to prevent dying from an overdose. Or we might agree that this person is pregnant, but we disagree about whether she should be able to get an abortion or not because we value the status of the fetus differently. So this would be an example of fundamental disagreements. We agree on the facts, but we disagree about what to do. A non-fundamental disagreement is the opposite. There's so much ambiguity over the facts, we can't reach consensus on what to do. And of course, the remedy for the two is different. The remedy for a fundamental disagreement is you got to do ethics. You got to figure out which value is most important given this fact situation and reasoning from the facts. A non-fundamental disagreement, we have to do fact-finding and insist on agreement in the facts. The last distinction is the difference between intrinsic reasoning and instrumental reasoning. So intrinsic reasoning means there's something inherently good. There's something good in itself that I want to do. So promise keeping would be an example, right? The idea of keeping a promise wouldn't make any sense if it only applied because of the outcomes or because of the consequences. So we would teach kids, if you make a promise, you have to keep it no matter what. That would be an example of intrinsic reasoning. Instrumental reasoning, though, means I'm going to accept the action that produces the best consequences. So whatever act I'm going to do is going to be the one that produces the most good. So with an injection drug user, I might say, I'm going to watch you, or a physician might say, I'm going to watch you inject your illegal drugs, but it's because I want to avoid the outcome of you dying. So I'm engaged in instrumental reasoning. So these are different types of reasoning. Now I want to put it in the context of values-based decision-making in the public sector and propose to you some things that we should at least think about when we're listening to people engage in public discourse. And the thing that I want to say we have to think about the most is this idea about justification. So epistemology, of course, is a Greek term for theory of knowledge, and basically what they're saying is, how can you define the word knowledge without using the word to know? And what they would say is justify true beliefs. So they would say all of us have beliefs, and our beliefs are either true or false, regardless of what we think about it. But the only basis I can expect you to accept my belief is true is the justification I give for it. So if I say to you, I expect you to accept my belief is true because I strongly believe it, that's not a rational justification, is it? Or because I sincerely believe it, or because I'm mistaken in my belief. So what we're looking for is the justification of the belief. So in the public sector, if we're going to look at what values should guide decision-making in the public sector, I'm going to propose a model. First, I think that we should prioritize instrumental reasoning over intrinsic reasoning. Doesn't mean intrinsic reasoning has no value, but I think we need to prioritize instrumental reasoning over intrinsic reasoning. And this means a couple of things we have to do. First, we've got to explicitly reject ideology. So if someone says, I think our public policy should be based on this because I strongly believe it, we would say, that's lovely, but that's not a rational basis to put our public policy on. And we also have to explicitly reject dogmatism. And this means that sometimes, no matter what the evidence says, people won't change their mind. So we have to reject dogmatism, and we have to explicitly reject ideology. Some examples of this, of ideological reasoning, promise keeping. So we have a government that would say, I promised this in my campaign, therefore I have to deliver it. But I made that promise under a certain fact situation, under a certain set of assumptions. But now I can't afford it. We can't afford it. But I'm going to do it anyway. How do I do it? Just borrow a little bit more money. Our opposition to gay marriage or this war on drugs, how much evidence do we have to have before we can show our public policy has devastating negative consequences? So the first thing I want to say is we've got to reject intrinsic reasoning and prioritize instrumental reasoning. Next, our conversations have to be about long-term benefit as opposed to short-term. So the conversation should be what's in the long-term best interest of our constituency, not necessarily what's in the short term. And these political cycles we have of 4 years are very short, and you can see, how do I get through my mandate right now? I don't have enough money to do what I've promised. I can borrow money, I pass it on to the next administration. They do the same. They borrow money, pass it on to the next. At the end of the day, it's our kids who are going to have to pay this $1.2 trillion back, but all of us are the ones that have spent it via the people we've elected to office. The last thing I want to say is our decisions have to be competent. And by competent, what I mean is they have to be empirically verifiable, and we've got to be open to evaluation. So by empirically verifiable, our conversations have to be rooted in the facts. What are the facts? Do we agree on the facts? And now, based on this fact situation, we can have a grown-up conversation about what to do. And we have to be willing to evaluate our decisions. So we make a decision, the best considered decision we have right now, but sometimes science, reality is different than a good idea. And there's a limit to a good idea. So if we find that, we've got to be open to revising it. And right now, frequently governments would say, I don't want to lose face, so I'm scared to revise my opinion. So what I want to say in summary is it's not enough to say that something is in the public's long-term best interest. You have to prove it. And this is a standard we should insist from our political types, is what is your proof for the standard you're proposing, not just is it a good idea or will it get votes. And the conversation has to change from making promises and then trying to keep those promises to discussions about long-term best interest. The caveat, of course, all of this is in context of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, so even though I'm talking about instrumental reasoning, I'm talking about it in this tax, borrow, spend cycle, not in terms of habeas corpus or individual rights and that type of thing. So in summary, I want to say we need to reject ideology and avoid dogmatism in our political discourse. We have to insist on a justification for what they're proposing. This means prioritizing instrumental reasoning, looking at long-term best interest, and insisting that our public policies are empirically verifiable. And then we have to be open to evaluation, which means if the facts work out differently than what our good idea is, We've got to call a spade and accept that. So, merci beaucoup et bonne soirée.